Hello, and welcome to Uniqlo Tate Late's Night In. My name is Inua Ellams, and I'll be your host for this evening. Tonight marks 1 year since Kara Walker's incredible Hyundai commission, Fons Americanus, first opened right here in the Turbine Hall. With everything that has taken place across the globe, we thought it was the right moment to return to this incredible artwork. And to revisit conversations around monuments, memory, racial justice, and civic space. Tonight, we'll bring together artists, historians, and activists working in London and the US. And there are 3 streams running side by side. You can either stick with one or jump between them. It's all up to you. Please don't forget to share your experience on social media using the hashtag #TateLate, all supported by Uniqlo. To kick off, we welcome historian David Olusoga, who will be speaking with the curators of Fons Americanus, Tate Clara Kim, about monuments, racial injustice, and the interconnected histories of the UK and the US.
Hello, my name is Clara Kim. I'm the curator of Fons Americanus, Kara Walker's Turbine Hall Commission. I'm here today interviewing David Olusoga. So perhaps we start there. Kara's work, was inspired by the Victoria Memorial in front of Buckingham Palace. And it's a kind of counter memorial. It sits 13 meters tall. It's a monument and a fountain in the Turbine Hall, which for us is a kind of public square. But of course, the work also raises really important questions about how we remember history and the role of public monuments in our cities.
Well, 2020 has been an astonishing year, a wonderful and a terrible year. It's frightening to think it's not entirely over, given how much there is to happen in America, an election in America. And one of the images that has come to mind as events have rumbled on is Fons Americana. It's hard to remember that this was a work that was commissioned and created before this great wave of change. And it was a subversive, a powerful, a shocking to many people work of art. Before that, it now turns out to have been a prophetic work of art in ways that nobody could have predicted, because this opening up of this history, this confronting of the other side of the British story, this creation of a mirror image monument to the monument that stands in front of Buckingham Palace, the Victoria Memorial, is in some ways a metaphor for what's happened, is that the other side of the coin of British history has been flipped, and suddenly it's visible, and it's visible to people who have not wanted to look at it, people who didn't know it was there. The coin was flipped by a new generation who were finding their voice and who demanded this other side of the story was told. And it's been remarkable that when the Black Lives Matter moment, when that storm crossed the Atlantic, it made landfall in Britain around our statues. History was pushed to the front lines of this debate. It wasn't all about history. Obviously, it was about racism and about racial disadvantage, but history was at the center of it. And so Fons Americanus was a kind of work that foreshadowed the events of 2020, and of course it's still there, and it is reopened into a different Britain.
So I wonder, for you as a historian, what you think about the role of artists, or art perhaps in its many different forms, in informing and shaping the discussion about the complexities of the histories, particularly in a context where so much still has to be written and so much still has to be taught in our schools.
Well, art was always part of this history, and in some ways as an historian what I try to do is to disavow and ignore this supposed division between the kind of world of the materials of history, of documents and artifacts, and the world of art, because I don't see and don't recognize that distinction. It's impossible to tell the story of the Atlantic slave trade in the British Empire without having to talk about art. What is the image? What is the great icon of the abolition movement, the one part of the story we remember. It's Josiah Wedgwood's symbol of the prone enslaved man. Am I not a man and a brother? What is the most important text in the story of slavery and the relationship between Britain and America through the goods produced by enslaved people and the bodies of enslaved people? It's a novel. It's Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So art, fine art, literature is central to this story. So art re-examining this history seems entirely appropriate because art is fundamental to this history. Art was at the core of efforts to both attack and both defend the slave system. The great Georgian cartoonist, George Cruikshanks, is today remembered as this kind of great satiricist. What's forgotten is that quite a lot of his work was done for the West India interest, which was the trade body almost of the slave traders and the plantation owners. So art was always conscripted into the battle around slavery. Art was one of the outlets for the wealth generated by slavery and the slave trade. So this division between what are the traditional materials of history and art, I think, just falls apart in your hands in most arenas, but especially so in this history. So I think Clara Walker's work is part of a long tradition, and I love the way it is embedded in references to both historical sources and historical works of art. I think you can see the thumbprint of the way art has been into the DNA of this history and hardwired into the story of slavery. You can see it emerging in all sorts of ways in Fons Americanus. I mean, what I see is a subversion of the way Africa is often depicted in Victorian, particularly Victorian memorial art, which is either a woman or a child, suggesting bountifulness and fertility and fecundity. That is a common way in which Africa is depicted. And what that depiction is saying is, here is a young continent, here is a fertile continent, here is a continent open for exploitation. But what Clara has done is she's made the figure of Mother Africa not only fertile and not only exploitable, but being exploited murderously with the slit in her neck and the water pouring from it. So it is a kind of subversion of a form of memorial art that was already subverting the image of Africa. It was the colonial gaze cast in bronze and cut into stone. And so it's re-subversion. It's the subversion of an already subverted art form. Is part of a long tradition.
I wonder, David, what you think, living in Bristol. I had the chance a couple of weeks ago to go visit the old Colston statue, the pedestal. And it was strangely, having seen all the events unfold on the news, and then going to see it after the fact, it left me with kind of a very strange feeling. It was removed from the event itself, and yet the pedestal still stood. And I wonder what you think about that, seeing it now, and what you might like to see happen to that old pedestal that's still standing.
I think what happened in Bristol this summer was that a new awareness of memorial art and what it really is, and where it really comes from, how old it really is, and what its functions really are, was brought about by a dramatic action. Now, there'd been a campaign for between 30 and 40 years to have the statue of a man who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people taken from a pedestal and put in display in a museum. And I think what this summer people understood, by this summer people understood that a statue on a pedestal is an act of memorialization. It is not neutral. It is not saying, here is your history. It is saying that this man is great, this man is good, this man deserves to be revered and to be respected. And there has been a sort of, quite dramatic reassessment. And I think it's partly fueled by that knowledge that these statues are figurative statues of individuals, that they are value judgments. And having a statue of somebody who did terrible things in a museum is one thing. Having it on a pedestal is completely different. And so the removal of Colston from the pedestal, I think, has been like a sort of act of purification for the city of Bristol. However, as an historian, I would now fight to the death for the statue to be preserved and to be on public display, to be viewed in a different context. And also, it's become a different object. It's toppling obviously has caused some damage. It was graffitied. The protesters painted his hands blood red, obvious allegory. They wrote words down the bronze body. And I know that the curators at the museum in Bristol are preserving that graffiti, rather like the sort of graffiti on the pyramids is of historical value, because some of it's so ancient. The damage and the graffiti on Colston has created a new work of art. It's no longer just a memorial to a forgotten slave trader. It is now a monument to the time in our history when we thought it was okay to memorialize a slave trader, to uncritically and unquestionably to revere him. But what people also learned this summer is these statues aren't very old. That statue is 125 years old. Colston died in 1721. He's 299 years ago. For 175 years, he was memorialized to ceremonies, to societies without a statue. The statue is a reflection not of what was happening in Bristol or England in 1721, but what was happening in Bristol in 1895. These statues have these histories people don't understand, and why should they? Some of these histories aren't very interesting. This is about the merchant elite of Victorian Bristol, not everyone's favorite pet subject. But what was revealed is that these statues aren't a mechanism for delivering history. They have another history, which is not connected very often to what is depicted. This new literacy about memorial art has been, I think, one of the great revelations in Britain, but in other countries during the course of 2020. It happened in America as well. People began to understand that the Confederate monuments that pepper the whole country, but particularly the South, weren't put up in the 1860s or the 1870s after the Civil War. They were mainly put up in the years around the First World War and the years around the 1960s, which were anniversaries of the war, but they were also moments when African Americans were demanding a better deal in civil rights. And you have this strange situation in America where you had defenders, people who want to defend this Confederate heritage as if it were their history, who were themselves older than the monuments from the 1960s that they were defending as if they were history. So we've understood, many of us, that these statues are complicated, that they have histories which are not the histories that they claim to depict, and that they're not how we learn history. We don't learn really anything about the British Empire from the Victoria Memorial, and yet it's got eagles which are supposed to depict the empire as an allegory in all sorts of ways of the empire and British power and British greatness. We don't really learn any of that from that memorial because that's not the thing memorials have the capacity to do. And also, we hardly notice them. They have a strange invisibility on the streets, and it's only really when they are contested and challenged by protests or challenged by an artist like Kara Walker creating a mirror image of them, a subversion of them that shows what they're not telling, the stories which aren't being narrated, that they suddenly become visible. I'm sure everybody who has been to see Fons Americanus, when they go past the Victoria Memorial, have a very different relationship with it. They probably didn't notice it before Kara's intervention.
I wonder also about your role, David, because you are both a professor at the University of Manchester, and you hold these positions of both being an academic, but also interfacing with the public through your career as a broadcaster. And I wonder about those two roles for you, whether you see them as integrally linked together, what you see as the future of education and more literacy, let's say, around these histories that need to be seen again.
Well, for me personally, history's always been public history. I've never wanted to be an historian who only wrote for other historians, whose books took place within a closed dialogue of narrow and narrower sects of people. But even if that hadn't been my predilection, the histories I'm interested in, the histories of empire and slavery and movement and migration, these histories are the most current political subjects of the moment. I mean, immigration, really since the sort of 1950s, has been one of the most important and one of the most controversial political issues in the United Kingdom. Dealing with the empire, its dismantlement from the 1940s until the 1970s was one of the great epic stories, one of the great political decisions and political processes of that period. So these histories are almost by their nature public, but never more so than now. And I think that's mainly to do with a generational shift. And I think the other story about 2020, and I think one of the reasons why I think Kara Walker's Fons Americanus was so prophetic, was it depicted a re-emergence of a history that had been suppressed. It was, to me, like an intrusion, almost like bursting through the ground, the floor of the turbine hall, of a history that had weight pressed upon it to keep it below the surface for centuries. And it has re-emerged into our consciousness the way it sort of burst into the turbine hall. And it's done that with a young generation, a new generation who aren't uncomfortable with having the conversations that their parents' generation didn't want to have, and their grandparents' generation definitely didn't want to have. They don't feel embarrassment about empire. What they feel embarrassment about is telling partial, incomplete versions of the British story. They know what they're being taught at school is only one side of the story, and they have the tools, more than any generation in history, to go looking for the information, the missing links in what they're being taught, and they're aware. And I think, I wrote after the toppling of Colston that this generation are not only historically literate, they're not only literate in the way that they're being told partial, incomplete histories. Because of that knowledge, they know their enemies when they see them, and they understand that people, men like Edward Colston, are not philanthropists to be celebrated, but they are mass murderers to be reviled, not forgotten. And they've never been interested. And historians who are committed to this have never been in the business of forgetting history or whitewashing history. It's about what we revere and what we don't.
David, what do you think is on the other side of that, if the other side of this kind of cultural shift?
Well, I think to be young in Britain today, especially to be young and urban in Britain today, is to live in a completely diverse culture, not just the people around you, but the culture that you consume. Young black kids, young white kids, all consume culture from people from all over the world. They are ambidextrous, they are completely voracious in their appetite for culture from all over the world. But I think there's something deeper in that. I think the relationship, the attitude of young people in this generation, the millennial generation, towards racism is profoundly different to that of older generations. They don't just lament the existence of racism. They don't just wish it wasn't there. They're not just trying not to be racist in their attitudes. They are anti-racist. They are actively opposed to racism, and they are willing to have the conversations and also the societal re-engineering that would be required to live in a society that's no longer shaped and disfigured by racism and racial hierarchies and racial disadvantage. And some of this is quite frightening. You can see why older people, why we have this sort of generational schism at the moment, why there is this urge among some people to dismiss young people as snowflakes or as over-political or over-sensitive. It's because of the sensitivities of the people who accuse them of being oversensitive. It's because they want to have these conversations. They want to discuss the taboo subjects, and they're willing to, and they are remarkably different in their attitudes. I mean, this idea, which I think is the central idea of Black Lives Matter, which is to not be involved, to be passive on the issue of race, is to be complicit in white supremacy and the maintenance of a racist society. That is an incredibly challenging idea for older generations. And yet I think that's fundamental to the mindset. It's barely challenged or questioned by the students who I teach.
Thank you very much, David. This has been a really great conversation. And I just learned that also Black and British, there's a children's edition of Black and British that is due out very soon. Is that correct?
That's right, on October the 1st. For the very simple reason that I kept being stopped on the streets by Black children and by Black parents, and white children and white parents, demanding that I write a children's book. The adults book is over 700 pages long. That's been great. I hope we get to do something similar back in the world whenever that happens.
Me too.
I miss the world. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Next up, hear from American artist, activist, and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors, discussing the relationship between art and social justice with Osei Bonsu, Tate Curator of International Art.
So, hi, Patrisse. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Very good to meet you.
Do you know what? I think before we start, I do want to mention a few things because I think they're important to mention with regards to your biography. And that is that you're an artist, an organizer, and a freedom fighter from Los Angeles. And I thought that would be a great way to start, just for you to really unpack those categories really, and how they speak to your development as a human being, but also how they speak to one another. I'd be curious to know a bit about your journey.
For sure. I'm just very honored to be in this conversation with you, especially about the subject matter, Kara Walker, and the work, I think, of so many brilliant Black artists who, in some ways, are being even more highlighted during this time because of the global movement that we've been in for some people, it's been 400 years. For others, it's been 7 years. And my work really comes out of being trained as both an artist and as a community organizer. Even though in a lot of ways, so much of the messaging I received as a young person was, you got to choose one or the other. I'm lucky that I didn't, and that I'm stubborn, and I chose to continue to be both an artist and an organizer. I think for me, growing up here in Los Angeles, in a place that has an extreme and obscene amount of wealth, as well as a place that has some of the most, tragically heinous, disturbing law enforcement agencies, the juxtaposition of sort of the wealth and the brutality is really what raised me. And I grew up as a dancer. I was a trained dancer from my youth until young adulthood. And I always tell people that I was, an artist before I was politicized. And so I really experienced, being trained in a very, technical fashion. And then as I became politicized, started realizing, oh, this world is really white and racist and sexist and fatphobic and ableist. And I was trying to, as a young person, hold a tension between having this really rich training that in some ways, really opened my eyes to other worlds, and also in some ways really saved my life, while at the same time was a really repressive environment. And that, my politicization actually led me into a performance practice, into a fine art practice. Not to say that the fine art world is any less racist or sexist, but there was a freedom I found in sort of moving away from this classically trained space and into a more organic place for my performance work.
So your work as an artist is largely rooted in, theatricality and performance, really thinking about the kind of practices, social practices of liberation and healing in which you're invested in as an activist. And I'm curious to know, in your development as an artist, has Kara Walker's work been an influence, and in what way?
Massive, 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 massive. Much like Betty Saar, Allison Saar, Kara Walker's work is probably, I'm thinking of the first time I saw her work was at the Hammer here in Los Angeles. And I remember going with a group of friends and stepping into the exhibit and feeling equally amazed, impressed, overwhelmed, disturbed, curious, and deeply moved. There's never been a moment that Walker's work doesn't move me and also stretch me. Like, her work has really, really stretches people, I believe, and it stretched me. And so I remember that exhibit, and that was my first introduction to her, probably in my early 20s. And I was like, how, like, what is she doing? Like, what is she channeling to bring this kind of work forward? And it actually was it was a really important place for me as an artist to give myself the opportunity to ask questions about what I was channeling, what I was trying to bring forth. And also, you know, her work scared me. I was like, I don't want all these white people looking at this. Like, this is like, I think this is work that we should only be seeing and like talking about and processing. And I was always really, you know, I remember in that exhibit feeling like almost self-conscious, like, I don't want this to be misunderstood. This work is too important, it's too special. And obviously, you know, we've seen, you know, during these last, I would say maybe 6-7 years, as people are trying to understand like the tension between art and our First Amendment rights, and, you know, what you're allowed to talk about and share about, and that complicated history. I think Walker just always shows up in her integrity through her work, and it has been really important work for me.
Her most recent work at Tate, Fons Americanus, is really a kind of monument dedicated to the transatlantic slave trade, and in a way builds on a lot of those themes and ideas that you speak about, but I think has drawn further relevance by the fact that in the past few months in Britain has seen the toppling of Edward Colston's statue in Britain, you know, the fall of Robert E. Lee's statue in the US, and other Confederate statues have really given people, I think, pause to think about the position that these statues have in our everyday lives and their association to the fight for Black lives. And I wonder how you see those things as being interrelated, and in what sense has the idea of the statue or the memorial made an imprint on your kind of experience as an organizer, but also as an artist who works in the domain of the public sphere?
So this new work of hers is, of course, epic, historical, timely. She has a way of doing that, of creating works that make our heads spin, digs us deeper into the kinds of conversations we should be having, no matter what. And I think, you know, I think a lot about the memorialization of white supremacy and what it has benefited, and how these statues, these memorials that we've seen being toppled, you know, in the last 5 years. I mean, there was a set of, you know, toppling of statues here in the States over the last 5 years, and then obviously in these recent months across the world, and specifically inside of Britain, that toppling of those statues, of those monuments, are clearly, you know, a toppling of white supremacy, and its, you know, most obvious form. And I think as Walker has created this new work that is memorializing the transatlantic slave trade, a slave trade that is often either undermined, denied, misinterpreted, made more palatable for white people. This piece and this work is a perfect moment and opportunity to talk about the gruesome history of the slave trade, the realities that whole human beings were stolen, and that their labor was extracted for free. And that labor was really, you know, seared by torture and abuse and terror. And I think, you know, the piece, I've only got to see it online. I can't wait, and hopefully I get to see it in person. Damn COVID. That this piece, you know, the thing about Walker's work is, like, she's usually telling a pretty grotesque story, but her pieces are aesthetically beautiful. And so this monument is really beautiful. It's really gorgeous to look at. And so there's something about, I feel like that has a lot to do with America, has a lot to do with the West in particular, these really gruesome acts, histories, and yet there's always this there's this way in which the West sort of like wraps things up really beautifully. And so this work, I think, is, yeah, she does this, like, where you could just go down the rabbit hole of like the meaning, the history, the present understanding of it. But I think much like, you know, the works that I've seen in the past, they feel like, oh, this is timeless work. Like this work we could be talking about forever.
I'm interested in the fact, art historically, that you were born in Los Angeles or California, and you had this constant relationship to a city in which, you know, the Watts Rebellion kind of foreshadowed your career as an activist, but also as an artist, because those were instances that artists responded to. And I was curious to know about how you perceive this relationship between art and social justice, because often it's perceived that one simply responds to the other, that artists respond. They're not protagonists or actors in this exchange, in this discourse. And I'd be curious to know how you perceive that.
Yeah, I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's really undermines the role of the artist in movements when we're seen as sort of the responders, or we're seen as the, you know, the people that get called by the organizer activists to show up. In fact, I believe that most of our organizers have also been artists. James Baldwin was clearly an artist. Langston Hughes, clearly an artist. Amir Baraka, the work of Emory Douglas. These organizers were not bystanders who were asked to show up to a moment. They were actually a part of the moments and showing up wholeheartedly. In our work inside of Black Lives Matter, some of the main players are artists, and we're consistently thinking about how we shift culture. Black Lives Matter is not just a project that is looking at changing policy. In fact, that was the last thing we were thinking about when we started Black Lives Matter. We were trying to shift culture. We were trying to challenge the way that white supremacy, the way that patriarchy, the way that homophobia and transphobia and ableism shaped our society and its relationship to anti-Blackness. We were keen on creating a slogan, a movement, obviously, but a culture that was not just responding to white supremacy, but a culture that was actually defined outside of white supremacy. And so the work of so many artists have been about shifting that culture and changing that culture. And I think, you know, we obviously are a movement of, you know, visual artists, performance artists, dancers, singers, hip hop artists, classically trained musicians. There's so much room and space inside of this movement world. And we do see ourselves as part of a long legacy of Black artists. I see myself as part of the Black artist movement. And there's, you know, a huge history, especially inside of the US, documented history of Black artists who were at the front lines and who were not just changing the material conditions for Black people, but also changing the very white art world. How many Black artists either made a decision to opt out of that world and say, we're going to build our own world, or made a decision to challenge that world and say that our art based in our aesthetics is important and necessary and is a revolutionary challenge to the history of white supremacy in the art world in particular.
And as you point out there, it's clear how Black Lives Matter is rooted in a much bigger history of a kind of resurrection of the civil and human rights movement. And in fact, so many artists were protagonists in that period. But one of the other factors when people look at the comparisons between then and now is obviously the rise and fixation on social media, and how that's played such a pivotal role both in the narration of and our kind of collective experience of these injustices. And I'd be curious to know how you think social media has both helped and hindered, as we know, the kind of cause.
Oh, social media. I think there's some things that separate, right? There's social media, which has been a megaphone for people like me, young Black women, queer, raised, working class and poor. And also we have to think about the corporations behind social media who have, whether they understood or they didn't understand, that their corporation would end up supporting the disruption of elections, supporting the racist terrorists that end up online and then end up killing offline. Those corporations have an actual duty to redesign and redirect what happens on the platforms that they created and they developed. And so, I think that the social media project has been both a dystopia and a utopia. It has created space for Black Lives Matter, Me Too, March for Our Lives, Women's March. It's created space for, people around the globe to be in direct relationship with one another within seconds. And yet it's also created a deep and dangerous place for many of us as well. It's the blessing and the curse of a really profound tool that has ushered in whole movements across the globe.
And you've talked about art in the past as being a platform to kind of heal and amplify, but increasingly people need spaces to heal. And actually, I think Kara Walker's work is an embodiment of that. But I also think that so much of the conversation that's happened of late concerning Black Lives Matter, particularly as it relates to Black people, is just the fatigue of everyday life, right? What it means to constantly have to perform in white spaces. So I'd be curious on two counts to really know about the advice that you'd give to other Black creatives, but also some of the tools that you've used during this time to really persevere as an activist and kind of to continue the fight.
My work is rooted in both the trauma and terror Black communities have experienced, as well as the way out of that trauma and terror, which I believe is healing justice in particular. And so what you'll see in my practice is a deep need to use performance as a place to heal, not just myself, but also the participants of the performance. I give directions to people when they come to my shows and to my events so that they can participate and see what collective healing is about. We live in a culture that is really obsessed with individualism, first of all, but secondly, the healing world is really about a healing that is deeply rooted in the individual. It's a very eat, pray, love understanding of healing, and that is the antithetical to Black people's way of healing. It is always in the collective. It's always in how we heal together and how we show up for one another. And so this idea of healing in our work, I really give a lot of praise to Black artists who have really taken seriously the role of healing in our work. We should be embracing healing justice in this moment. I don't think that we'll be able to, get to the places of liberation that we need to get to without a healing justice framework and practice, both individually and collectively.
Something you've said relates to the idea that irrespective of party political divides, it's so important that Black people think about political forces that are simply going to allow us as a community to sustain Black life. What do you think of the political landscape now and where Black Lives Matter fits into it? But also, how do you as an individual kind of perceive of that landscape?
Well, the political landscape, to say it plainly, is trash. But I will say that it's been trash for a long time. And where we're at now has everything to do with a culmination of a decades-long ignorance and willful denial of what is actually needed, not just inside this country, but I argue the globe, which is a Black agenda, an agenda that actually deals with the history of slavery and its impacts on the economy and Black people in particular. And as long as our governments ignore and deny that the liberation of Black people is actually tied into the liberation of all of us, we're going to be in this very sick, disturbing cycle where we are held hostage by white supremacy, held hostage by patriarchy, and held hostage by the vestiges of the transatlantic slave trade. And so, in the meta view, our movement started not under Trump, but actually under the Obama administration. It started under an administration who, for all intents and purposes, everybody thought, so much change would come, but it didn't actually. And while we are probably dealing with the worst presidency of our lifetime, Trump isn't the only evil. There are many, and capitalism and racism and sexism are those evils. And so we have to deal with that. We can't blame politics for what we're in right now, but we have to be, and when I say we, I mean all of us, civilians, elected officials, global citizens, we have to show up for these moments and make sure that the people who are in power are listening to us and push them into action. And sometimes they will listen and sometimes they won't. And so in my own individual capacity as Patrisse Cullors, I clearly believe that Trump needs to be out of office, not just for the United States' sake, but the globe's sake. But I also really want to challenge the next people who come into office, hopefully, God willing, that they take this next phase of our movement very seriously. We've been calling for, a new plan, a new deal, a new set a new reality for a very long time. And that time is now.
We're ending Stream 1 with Mohammed Laouli's exploration of the heart of Marseille. Over to Tate Film.
So hi, my name is Valentine Umensky. I'm a curator here at Tate Modern, and it's my pleasure tonight to be talking to Mohammed Laouli. Mohammed is a Moroccan artist born in Salé, Morocco, and he currently is based in Marseille, France, where tonight's film Les sculptures n'étaient pas blanches, the sculptures weren't white, is based. Mohammed's approach consists of a critical reflection on the systems of power that he witnesses, most often political and economic, but also sometimes cultural ones, as we'll see. And I met Mohammed in 2014, actually in preparation for the Belluard Bollwerk Festival in Switzerland, for which we crafted together with a group of curators a very unusual project questioning both the notion of European migration at the time when the European Union was reinforcing its borders, and the idea of collective prejudice. One image remains really in my mind, and it's that time when Mohammed took me to Salé, his hometown, and we walked together through the town, and specifically we went to the area where he was working, filming fishermen along a narrow river that separates the wealthier Rabat from Salé. And I remember how Mohammed collected their stories with his artistic and life partner at the time and current partner, Catherine Strobel. And he transformed, together with Catherine, those local stories into a subtle political comment, creating a piece with performance and video. So I wanted to mention this because from that river, we're talking now a little bit about the Mediterranean Sea. The film that you're going to see tonight talks about another body of water, although indirectly, as it discusses the effect of colonial memorialization in Marseille, a city whose population is about 50% a population of migrants. I just wanted to add a note about the context in which we chose Les sculptures n'étaient pas blanches, the sculptures weren't white, which is also the specificity of this film being shot in Marseille, in France, responding to the question of the toppling of the statue and the Black Lives Matter movement, but from a French perspective and from a Moroccan perspective in France. And it's really important to keep in mind that although the toppling of statues, media-wise, has been broadcast mostly coming from the US, actually the movement, the toppling of statues movement started in the French colonies, namely in Fort-de-France in Martinique last May. And that was a response to two sculptures of Victor Schœlcher being toppled. So for us, it was really important to also shed light on this question from a Moroccan perspective in France. And the film, The Sculptures Weren't White, responds in a unique way to also the current movement towards decolonialization and the toppling of statues through a very performative gesture that Mohammed is enacting on one of Louis Bottinelli's sculpture created at the time for the Exposition Coloniale, the colonial exhibition, and now shown in Marseille. So Mohammed, welcome again. And can you tell us maybe a little bit more about the film and the context in which it was created?
The film, The Sculpture Weren't White, is a kind of one shot of fixed frame camera on this monumental sculpture at the central train station in Marseille, in the south of France. The sculpture represents a naked woman half reclining in an offering position, which suggests a passive availability of the body offered and delivered to the eyes of the metropolitans. My interest in these urban allegories comes from my interest in the trace of colonization in the public space and its impact on the daily life today, to reflect on how contemporary sites can carry residual memories of trauma. 2 years ago, I made an intervention on a monument in Marseille named the Monument to the Fallen of Army of the Orient and Distant Lands, and at the waterfront in Marseille. And the work is documented in video where we can see me dressed in a blue overalls doing a kind of frottage on a plate of marble which represents a memorial, kind of tribute to the Harki. The Harki are the Algerian who participates in the War of Algiers with the French. This were the starting point of my interest to these monuments.
And if I go back to specifically the gesture that you're making in this film, you're dressed in blue overalls and you literally go and clean this one statue that has been covered in red paint. Can we talk a little bit about maybe the specific gesture that you are making? Because when we chatted earlier, you mentioned something that really interested me about the notion of care. And maybe in a time when there is so many violent toppling of statues and even vandalizing of statues, the act that you make on this statue is very specific. Can we talk a little bit about this idea maybe?
Colonies of Africa interest me a lot since I came here in Marseille, because I live in the center, so I see many times this sculpture, and sensory, I don't know how to approach it, to make a work with it. During Black Lives Matter, I realized that the sculpture were covered in red paint, And then I see that there was a relation that was created with my work, and this, at that moment, I decided to step in with a gesture of taking care of this naked African woman and immaculated with blood in the front of the gaze of passersby. I have to say that I found it very violent also to have this red color on this body, because what I found it paradoxal is in other places in the world, in Britain, in Bristol, or in the States, or in Cape Town, this gesture of the prestators was have a meaning, because it's about figures that represent men who were introduced in this colonial violence. But in this case of this sculpture in Marseille, Colonie d'Afrique, colonies of Africa, this sculpture it's a different sculpture, because the representation is different. So it's a naked woman, to put the red paint on her naked body is also violent as a gesture,
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the way you're presenting yourself, because it is almost like a performative gesture, and you're actually dressed with a specific outfit.
Why I'm dressed in a blue overalls? Because I tried to be in a equal position. You know what I mean? And it's a kind of modesty toward this woman, to rethink this relationship with the colonized, but also with the figure of the African immigrant who took care of the metropolis. I tried to stage myself in a cleaning ritual, that surmounts the figures of North African immigrant, who came to France to clean and rebuild the France of the glorious 30s, So there's one important point that is really important for me, because this ritual is inspired from a protocol of the Maghribian hammam, where one takes care of the body of the others by removing the residue of the dirt which sticks on the body without harming the skins of the subjects.
Well, thank you. I think that wraps up our conversation and introduction to the film, but I wish you all a really good time watching it, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Bye.
That's it from us. We hope you've enjoyed the mix of ideas, exchanges, and artists this evening. If you've been inspired by what you've seen tonight, you can visit Tate Modern to see Kara Walker's Fons Americanus up until the 8th of November. It's 100% free, the way I like things, and just hop online to book your free ticket before you visit. We hope to see you for the next Uniqlo Tate Late Night In, with its mix of ideas, art, and music streaming monthly. Don't forget, you can catch up on anything you've missed. And please keep sharing your experiences on social media using the hashtag TateLates. My name is Inua Ellams, and thank you for joining us.